Welcome to Tuesdays with Merton. My name is Teresa Sandock. I'm a Servite sister and a member of the Tuesdays with Merton Planning Committee, along with Daniel Horan and Sophronia Scott, with the assistance of Alan Culp. Tuesdays with Merton is co-sponsored by the International Thomas Merton Society and the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. Please note that we are recording this webinar. It will be available on YouTube and as a podcast soon after the live event. I would now like to invite Sophronia Scott to offer an opening prayer.
Thank you, Teresa. I am going to offer two brief paragraphs from Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. The more we are alone, the more we are together, and the more we are in society, the true society of charity, not of cities and crowds, the more we are alone with him. For in my soul and in your soul, I find the same Christ who is our life, and he finds himself in our love, and together we all find paradise, which is the sharing of his love for his Father in the person of their Spirit. Let us live in this love and this happiness, you and I and all of us, in the love of Christ and in contemplation. For this is where we find ourselves and one another as we truly are. It is only in this love that we at last become real. For it is here that we most truly share the life of one God in three persons. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophronia. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Cassidy Hall. Cassidy is an author, award-winning filmmaker, podcaster, and leading voice in contemplative spirituality. She is the co-host of the Encountering Silence podcast and the creator of the Contemplating Now and Queering Contemplation podcasts. Her films include In Pursuit of Silence and Day of a Stranger. The latter is an intimate portrait of Thomas Merton, which I had the pleasure of viewing at the ITMS General Meeting at St. Mary's College last June. Cassidy currently resides in Indianapolis, where she is studying for her Doctor of Ministry degree. Cassidy has pre-recorded her presentation, and she will join us live for the Q&A session. Here now is Cassidy Hall speaking on Queering Thomas Merton.
Hello, and thank you so much to the Tuesdays with Merton team for inviting me to join you today. And I'm just thrilled to have this conversation with you and to dive into what it means to queer something, what queer theory is, what queer theology is, and what it has to do with Thomas Merton. So as we move through this conversation together, I want to begin by talking about my journey into the work of Thomas Merton, how I first started reading him, what I was reading, and why it mattered in the context of my life. So I'll begin by saying that in 2011, 2012, I started reading New Seeds of Contemplation. And I was reading this book in between clients as I was working as a substance abuse counselor in Iowa. And my life at the time was in a particular situation where I was getting progressively burnt out at my job. I was navigating what it means to be a queer woman. I was exploring a lot about and as I was reading New Seeds of Contemplation, this book was just incredibly meaningful to me at that time. And first I want to go back to the origin of New Seeds of Contemplation. So as many of us know, New Seeds of Contemplation was originally published as Seeds of Contemplation in 1949. So it wasn't until 1962 when the work was revised and expanded and also retitled, adding the new seeds of contemplation. So what I think is so interesting about this is looking very briefly at the context of Thomas Merton's life and the evolution of this book, the expansion of this book, the ways in which he felt it necessary to even create an expanded version. So that being said, we can look at the ways in which, okay, published in 1962, well, that was after his Fourth and Walnuts Epiphany, which was 1958. And after he really started talking explicitly about being anti-war, being anti-bomb, and the many ways in which he was encouraging folks to rethink what war is in the context of religion, in the context of spirituality, including this was also republished after his famous essay, The Root of War is Fear, which was in the Catholic Worker in 1961, and after beginning communication with Father Dan Berrigan. And this is at the precipice of censorship from the Abbey, which came in 1962 as well. So that's when Peace in the Post-Christian Era was denied publication. And Merton himself said that the expansion and the new edition of the book was not simply to make a larger book out of a small one, but to say many new things that could profitably be added to the old. And so again, I just love, we talk a lot about all the things Merton has spoken to, all the topics and all the issues. But I think there's something really beautiful about also pointing to the ways in which his evolution of thought occurred in those things, his expansion of self, his infinite becoming, his own unfolding. We saw a lot of his unfolding on the pages, right? And highly recommend this piece that is in a Merton annual, I believe, called Merton's Journey from Seeds to New Seeds by Ruth Fox. And that covers in great detailed specificity of the difference between seeds and new seeds. So I'm in my office at this seemingly dead-end job. My anxiety is increasing. I have my first panic attack. I'm navigating who I am and what I am to speak to and why am I here. And I come across the essay Integrity, which we find in New Seeds of Contemplation. And this particular portion just struck me like a bell calling me to prayer in the core of my being. And in that essay, he writes, many poets are not poets for the same reason that many religious people are not saints. They never succeed in being themselves. They never become the person or the artist who is called for by all the circumstances of their individual lives. They waste their years in vain efforts to be some other poet, some other saint. They wear out their minds and bodies in a hopeless endeavor to have somebody else's experiences or write somebody else's poems. So this was my introduction to the concept of the true self. And also, as we know in New Seeds, there's a lot of work surrounding the concept of the true self, what that is, what that means. And this led me to thinking, okay, this means something. And I want to go see the place from where this was written. Where did these words come from? Why are they so powerful to me? What's the meaning here? And with no plans and no expectations, really, I traveled to Gethsemane Abbey for a long weekend and completely fell in love with the space. fell in love with the solitude, the spaciousness, the silence, fell in love with the ways in which I could get in touch with who I was in that silence and solitude. And I could get in touch with making sense of some of the concepts like this that Merton was writing about. So to make a long story somewhat short, I came back from that long weekend back into my job, and I thought to myself, okay, that was amazing. Let me learn more about these Trappist monasteries. So I got on my computer, found out at the time there were 17 Trappist monasteries, and started reaching out to different monasteries asking about availability to come visit. And it worked out in such a way that I was able to then travel to all 17 Trappist monasteries, um, the end of 2012 into 2013, from the Redwoods Monastery of California to Spencer in Massachusetts. I drove and met with monks and nuns and talked with them about silence and solitude and contemplative life. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I needed to do it. I knew there was something to that essay on integrity that was something I was finding in my own life. So ultimately, this led to working on the documentary film In Pursuit of Silence. And I lived in Los Angeles for that time. And then that led to me going to seminary here in Indianapolis for my Master's of Divinity and Master's of Theological Studies, where I'm now studying for my doctorate. And during that time, I also made a short documentary about Thomas Merton called Day of a Stranger. And that film is largely based on Thomas Merton's Hermitage years, using audio that he recorded from inside the Hermitage space and the natural sounds there. And now, coming out next year, I have a book called Queer in Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. So here's where we're going to kind of pivot and get into what does queer have to do with it? Well, I first want to begin by going back to what we were talking about regarding the true self and the ways in which I began exploring the concept of the true self and my notions of my true self when I was reading Thomas Merton. And from that, there was also something stirring inside me that kept being curious and asking the questions of whose voices are missing in this. If I'm learning the true self concept from presumably cisgender, straight, celibate, white men, right? I also was reading, Richard Rohr and Henry Nouwen at the time, and they also write on the concepts of the true self. And what can I learn from a cisgender, presumably straight, white man about being a queer woman in America? Or what can others' true selves learn from these men who have different social locations, different experiences, different intersections of being marginalized? And so as I started asking that question more and more, I started to begin to step into my own thoughts and my own ways of thinking about the true self, what it means to me, what it means for me, and kind of expanding these notions beyond particular boxes, right? Because also these men all come from the Roman Catholic Church, right? Which is a institution that doesn't allow women or queer folks to be ordained, and continues to, cultivate a hierarchy, causing all kinds of abuse and pains and violence on people. And that is not to say that, Protestant views and perspectives don't also perpetuate this. Obviously, this is a significant issue in many realms, many layers. The point is, when we only yield to an idea cultivated from someone whose social location is entirely different from ours, how can we truly understand that idea for ourselves? So for me, as a queer woman, and of course, every queer experience is different. So, for another queer cisgender white woman, it would be a different experience from my own. Okay, so what is queer theory and what is queer theology? So generally, the big point I want to get across is that queer theory is something that encourages us to look at things differently, to look through new avenues. It dismantles and takes down our traditional assumptions about things, specifically about gender, sexual identities, challenges traditional academic approaches, and fights against social inequality. So related to that, and this information is from Indiana University, by the way. Related to that, so when we queer something, queering is not always about imposing queerness on an area, but about utilizing these lenses of queer theory to imagine new, previously unidentified possibilities. So in this way, we can think about queering something as a way to see differently, a way to look differently, a way to be prophetic about possibilities. Queer theology, on the other hand, is theology done by LGBTQIA plus folks and their allies. And it's about seeing ourselves in those stories and recognizing ourselves in those stories. So when we bounce back and forth here between queer and Thomas Merton, so what does queer have to do with Thomas Merton? Well, when we understand queer as a word of resistance to the normative and the status quo, and when we understand queer as an invitation into being non-dualistic, to host infinite spaciousness, to host endless possibilities, we might be able to see the ways that queer lives in different aspects of our uniqueness, or different parts of our weirdness, or our aliveness, or our ever becoming. And the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey explores queer theory as a theory of deconstructing sexuality, normativity, and binaries. So again, like I said, every queer experience is different. So when I'm coming at this conversation, I want to be very clear that I am only speaking from my queer experience. I am only speaking from my contemplative experience. I am only speaking from my perspective of the work of Thomas Merton. And what I mean when I say queer, well, queer is not just related to my sexuality, but queer is the way I tilt my head to look at the world. And when I think about queering something, I think about being invited to see and look at things differently, and having that openness, that open stance, as James Finley calls the inner stance of the least resistance, right, to the gift of possibilities. And I see queer as an invitation into these things, into curiosity, life beyond the status quo. And queer is outside of boxes and categories, an invitation into limitless expanse and boundless curiosity. So when we queer the ways we look at contemplation, or when we look at Thomas Merton, or even seeing their innate queerness, right? Contemplative life is innately strange and odd, and it encourages us to tilt our heads to look at the world, to see things differently, to deepen our roots of compassion and love. Contemplation invites us into queerly living. So in this way, I think queering something also invites us into recognizing the widening view of incarnation in our lives and the ways in which the image of God is among us, within us, and all around us. One of my favorite quotes about the word queer comes from a book called The Body's Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. And in that book, she quotes the Black poet Brandon Went. And he says, "Not queer like gay, queer like escaping definition, queer like some sort of fluidity and limitlessness all at once, queer like a freedom too strange to be conquered, queer like the fearlessness to imagine what love can look like and pursue it." Another quote that I really enjoy comes again from the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who says that to say that I'm queer is not only my self-identity, it is also my active engagement against heteronormativity. When we're talking about things like heteronormativity or, the status quo, these kinds of things, we're talking about things that are imposed in our lives as expectations, right? To be actively against the script that we're handed in our lives that might not be for us. And so I think that's really important to kind of recognize that, the boxes that we are put in are not the boxes that we necessarily belong in. And I mean, in my personal opinion, there should be no boxes. We should be out of boxes and out of categories, and the ways in which we box ourselves in and box each other in minimizes our ability to continually be who we are, continually navigate our true self, continually unfold and explore and recognize ourselves in the newness of our perpetual becoming. So, taking these concepts and thoughts, let's talk about Thomas Merton. And I want to talk about the ways in which I see Thomas Merton's queerness. So I see Thomas Merton as a monk who is beyond boxes and categories and open to the possibilities within the true self. And as he says in New Seeds of Contemplation, he talks about the ways in which sanctity consists of being himself, and sanctity consists of others being themselves. And he says, for me, to be a saint means to be myself. And what I love about this is that some of these broad strokes that Merton does with the true self is very inviting, very curious, very open-ended, and very welcoming to the possibilities of our true selves, of discovering the fullness, the expanse of the true self. So Thomas Merton as embodied, as erotic, as in touch with his own sexuality, right? We see the writings for M, we see the poetry for M on a cold gray morning where he writes, "We are nearer than we know. Love has another place of its own. Nearer to you than hill or city, nearer than your own mirror. You wake in another room, and the bed where you slept is a nest in my heart." And then in the essay, Day of a Stranger, I love the way he writes about this love of silence. He talks about, he says, perhaps I have an obligation to preserve the stillness, the silence, the poverty and virginal point of pure nothingness, which is at the center of all other loves. And he also says, one might say I had decided to marry the silence of the forest. The sweet dark warmth of the whole world will have to be my wife. We see Thomas Merton as a person of paradoxical truth, someone who is holding something beyond binaries, beyond structure, and beyond expectation, right? He says things like art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. He says that contemplation is beyond explanation, beyond discourse, beyond dialogue, beyond our own self. And in general, in the ways that he shows up as a monk beyond boxes and categories, this is the man who made up his own rules in many ways and, found out a way to make a tool shed his first hermitage, right? Where he names St. Anne's tool shed his first hermitage space. And he corresponds with folks across religions, ideas, genders, sexualities, and, what's world affairs. This is the man who did a jazz meditation in a hermitage during the Louisville riots while listening to Jimmy Smith. So what if we took all these things, right? What if we looked at Merton and his work as invitational, as expansive, as a model of possibility beyond the boxes and categories that we've put him into? What if we freed ourselves in the ways we look at Thomas Merton by releasing him from the bounds of Catholicism, from the expectations of being a monk or monastic life, or even contemplative life? And what if we queered the way we read his work and considered his voice as one who points us to other voices, other wisdom traditions, other social locations, and even our own voice and experience? What if we allowed and honored the image of God to speak beyond the status quo about the many topics that Thomas Merton speaks to? In the film I did, Dave a Stranger, there's a couple quotes that folks always really come back to. And one of those quotes is about mysticism. And Thomas Merton discusses the mysticism of isness. And he says that the most crucial thing, at least for me, is the necessity to dig into what one is. A mysticism of isness, a mysticism of existence, a mysticism of accepting what is right here and now, right in front of your nose. And again, these broad strokes of true self are very invitational, are very open-ended, are very possible to the expanse of who you are, who I am. And I see so much of his work, in particular on the true self, as invitational work for all of us. In the film, he also says, I know in my heart that I do not need to be defined. I do not need to define myself. And yet, I have this allergy of definition. And Merton has shown us in his journals and other writings, and in this audio from the film, the ways in which he is still exploring himself. He was still allowing room and spaciousness for his own unfolding. He was still allowing himself to be outside of categories and boxes and expectations. And this quote is always very striking to me, and it's invitational. What is our allergy of definition? What are the parts or the pieces of ourselves that we hang on to where there's no room for expanse, growth, or evolution? And in that way, what parts of myself, what parts of yourself, what parts of ourselves are calling to be queered? And what thoughts about Merton or contemplative life are longing to be queered. So as we kind of come to the end of our presentation portion, I want to come back to one final quote from Pamela Lightsey, who wrote a book called Our Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology, which is an excellent, excellent book. And she talks about the reclamation of the word queer, because for many of us, that's a difficult thing to even consider. For some of us, it's only been a derogatory term in our lives. And so the understanding of reclaiming it is hard to fathom. And not only that, but the understanding of reclaiming it alongside queering it, right? Even queering the word queer, as we're doing in this conversation, might seem kind of radical. And she talks about the ambiguity of queerness. She says queer is ambiguous not simply because it is being reclaimed in new ways, but because it suggests that while sexuality is real, it should not be constructed as necessarily taking one permanent form. So to identify as queer is to assert a type of fluidity in life, particularly sexuality. And I see the many ways in which Thomas Merton modeled this fluidity. I see the many ways in which contemplative life reveals to us this fluidity. I believe that to be agile in life, to be open in life, to be freely holding things with our hands open, with our hearts open, is a queer way to live. It is a stance of possibility. It is a stance of openness and curiosity. So if any of this interests you and you want to talk more about it, first of all, I'm excited for our Q&A portion, but I also want to say that I am happy to discuss this with anyone. And I am currently doing a podcast called Queering Contemplation, which is hosted by the Christian Century. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And I am interviewing scholars and queer clergy and folks who are just reimagining what queerness is in the context of contemplation and the context of contemplative life. And then my book, Queering Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality, will be out in May of 2024. And you can scan that QR code to find a pre-order link. That will also take you to my website, CassidyHall.com. And it will also take you to the podcast website. So finally, as we begin in some of Thomas Merton's early writings, I also want to end with some of Thomas Merton's early writings. And that is what he shares in the Latin at the end of the 7-Story Mountain. And that is, this may be the end of the book, but not the end of the searching. It is my hope that this is the end of the presentation, but may it not be the end of my searching, of your searching, of our searching for our true selves, for our own unfolding, and for our continual becoming. Thank you.
Wow, Cassidy, that was pretty amazing. You leave me breathless. So,
Thanks, Alan.
yeah, thank you for 2 or 3 things that I want to enumerate, and then I want to jump into some questions and conversation with you. One, just thanks for helping us understand and become functional with the word queer. I can imagine many of us on the call simply don't use that word for whatever reason. But I think your ability to use it to be really clear helps us both to understand it and become functional in our own way. So I really appreciate that. Also, thanks for personalizing your own journey around the word. It gives us a sense of how you're doing it. And there's nothing probably better than hearing a story. And then this one is an embodied story, which is appropriate. That really shows us how to do it. Reminds me, I just recently finished up a series on the incarnation, and Kathleen Norris has a wonderful line about well, the incarnation is better off shown than told about. That way you get the real sense of its power. And she imagines, wouldn't it have been interesting had Mary decided to write a treatise or issue an essay on the incarnation? Yeah, no, it was more interesting that she just had a baby. So show, don't tell. And third, I don't know whether to thank you or not on this one, but thanks for the challenge of the presentation. It was not only about you and queer, but you wound up actually challenging me, and I imagine feeling like challenging others. So I appreciate that. To jump into question and conversation, I want to use one by Monica Weiss to start with. You know, a friend of both of us. She says the early use of queer was seen as a pejorative term for members of the gay community. You've chosen to explode that meaning and broaden it to the kind of awareness that Merton and several other mystics advocate. You want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I addressed that a little bit in the presentation with regards to the word being reclaimed, right? And referencing the scholarship of Pamela Lightsey and the ways in which, you know, the word being reclaimed is not only taking back power, but also a way to, step more deeply into oneself. And I think, right, we don't see that happen with every pejorative or negative word that's used against people. So I think it's particular words, right? Like queer being reclaimed is a particular choice. There are other pejorative words about queer folks, about LGBTQIA plus folks that are not being reclaimed, right? And perhaps that's for a reason. But I think queer has a unique, I also like that, what did she say about mystics in there?
Something about you've chosen to explode that meaning and broaden it with a kind of awareness that Merton and several other mystics advocate.
Yeah. And I think, you know, speaking of queerness, I think there's a lot of queerness in mysticism. So I appreciate that she said that, because I think that mystical expression, mystical encounter, mystical experience is another invitation into the weirdness, the oddity, the strangeness, the ways we see life differently, right? The mystics fall in love with trees. So that's, I won't go that angle, but ultimately queer being reclaimed is a way to step into our power, step into the power of and control of one's narrative.
One of the things I was aware of, and I want to ask you about it, is as I was listening to you talk, we get queer, we get queerness, which are nouns, but queering or to queer, you were using it as a verb. I usually tell students, well, verbs are the action word. Use verbs. They're the words with real power. You get your nouns after verbs. And so it really struck me that queering and to queer something as a verb is a real action word. And I was watching you, it almost sounds like it's a way of reflecting on life deeply, or even a way to do theology if you were to throw God in it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think for me, it's especially, you know, again, like I said in the presentation, every queer experience is different, just like every contemplative experience is different, just like Every human experience is different. And I think that the ways in which I'm using queering is very specific to my experience of what it means to be a contemplative, what it means to be a queer woman, because I see in particular the ways in which queerness has enlivened and awakened my contemplative life, and vice versa, the ways contemplation has awakened myself as a queer woman. And in many ways, I see those things as very entwined. The ways in which, contemplative life hosts oddity, mystery, strangeness, curiosity. And similarly, the ways I live as a queer woman, right? I talk about how it's the way I tilt my head to look at the world. And I think similarly, contemplation invites us to tilt our heads to look at the world.
Yeah, you may be already answering that question, but when you said for you, queering and queerness has, I'm going to say, everything to do with contemplation. Could you expand that a bit? I think about the wonderful words of Merton in the beginning of New Seeds. You talked about that as your beginning. The first 3 or 4 pages, he goes on and on about contemplation is one of my favorite pieces from all of Merton. So how does queerness and being contemplative connect so deeply for Cassidy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. For me, it's the boundless nature of contemplative life. It is my experience of contemplation, both as a practice and way of being in the world, as an identity and as an encounter of boundlessness. For instance, I was at a Zen meditation practice on Monday nights, and I, sitting flanked between 2 other silent souls next to me, the ways in which that container of silence holds everything and nothing, the ways in which everything is there and nothing's there, right? We're releasing our suffering, but yet we're also witnessing it. And I think that there's something about contemplative life for me that reminds me of the boundlessness in terms of depths. Ultimately, contemplative life connects my roots more deeply to others, whether that be through experience, whether that be through suffering, whether that be through deepening understanding. But ultimately, contemplative life shows us that there is no arrival. And queerness also does that, because queerness tells us that we can continually become who we are. And contemplative life continues to say, and we can continue to be more connected to ourselves and more connected to each other.
Yeah, you had a wonderful term at some point during the half hour, queerly living. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I've used the term, living contemplative and living contemplatively often. Would those two be synonymous for you, queerly living and living contemplatively?
That's a great question. I have not thought about that. Yeah, I think most of the time, yes. And a lot of that for me goes back to, my primary centerpiece of how I define contemplation. It comes from the Spiritual Directors of Color Network founder, Therese Taylor Stenson. And she says that for contemplation to be whole, its wholeness relies on both inward solitude and reflection and an outward response to what we find ourselves present and awake to. And in that way, I would say, yes, they're interchangeable, because queerness and contemplation represents both my inner and outer life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you have to be a true self to be able to queerly live?
No, I mean, I think, speaking of, paradoxical truths, which came up in the talk, are we ever our true selves? I mean, are we ever fully our true selves?
I get to ask the questions. You have to answer.
Yeah, I mean, if we're always continually moving towards our true self, and if the contemplative life is never arriving, then I think that no, you can be wherever you are to be whoever you're moving towards.
Yeah, maybe Merton had it wrong. He should have had you as a teacher. I'm just thinking it should have been truing self instead of true self. What do you think?
It could work. It could work. Should we rewrite the book?
He's done it once. I don't think I want to mess with it. I like it the way it is. Another question along these lines, given your definition of queerness, I wonder, can I also queer life? And is in fact everybody potentially a candidate in that definitional way?
That's my hope in the way I'm using the word queer, is that it can be seen as a less scary word for folks and a less intimidating word, because I do think it is a word of invitation. I do think it is a word that hosts a lot of possibilities. And, back to me saying that, this is one queer experience and one contemplative experience, whereas, another LGBTQIA plus person might disagree with the way I'm using the word queer. And so I think it's really important to understand queer as one needs to understand it, but also host that sensitivity towards everyone's personal experience.
That was felicitously put.
Thank you. There's a book called Outside the Lines about queerness enlivening faith by the Reverend Mihi Kim Court. And she also uses the word queer as an invitational word related to Christianity in particular and the spiritual context.
Yeah, I'd like to explore a bit now with you. I'm going to change directions a bit. Sort of where God might be in all of this. I'm interested in, as you were talking, one of the questions I noted to myself as I roll along is, how is queer related to prophecy and prophets? So I'm interested in whether, well, maybe your reaction first. Let's start with that. Do you see any relationship particularly to the prophets and the prophecy?
Related to queerness?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I was in a class today, and we're talking about autoethnography and the ways in which our personal stories can, enliven and awaken research methods and these kinds of things. That part's not particularly interesting. The interesting part is that when we tell our own stories, because we are the experts in our own stories, when we tell our own stories, we give each other the gift of widening incarnation. When we don't tell our stories, when we don't share our experiences, we also limit the vastness of the sight of God. And so in that way, I think it's of course, it's not just queerness that can be prophetic, but I think in that way, our stories and expanding the image of God, speaking more into that over and over and over again as we share our stories, can reveal God, and in that way be a sense of prophecy. But with regards to we were talking earlier about the prophetic nature of speaking and seeing beyond what is here. And so not just related to the image of God, but also being able to see and speak beyond the status quo, beyond heteronormativity, beyond patriarchy, beyond the things that keep us kind of in a cyclical, stagnant way of being, that don't actually expand our horizons to things like communal care or liberation and the ways in which we're all interconnected.
Yeah, I'm going to invite my friend and your friend Sophronia in. She's going to be participating in these Q&As and is going to ask one now. I'd like to turn us into a trio if we can. Sophronia?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So a few minutes ago, I think I heard you talk about a kind of dichotomy between a silent solitude presence versus being out and engaged in the world. And it seems to me, and if I'm hearing that right, do you think Merton would have lived that way had he had lived, breaking these boundaries of what a monk's life was supposed to look like, and living in these two different spaces?
Yeah. I love that question. And yes, I do. And I think, right, he modeled that for us verbally and mentally on the page, because essentially he was speaking to many things, but he wasn't physically present, like on the streets at a protest or something like this. But I do think that that was the momentum of his life. I do think that would have eventually led that way, because I think the ways in which he spoke to those things was unlike a lot of other monastic writing we see. And I think that he was particularly attuned and curious about what full engagement meant for him.
And I think that that's also what the Buddhist monks were sharing with him when he was in Asia on that last trip, encouraging to view his presence in the world more broadly.
Yeah. And that restlessness, right? That restlessness we see in him that just follows him everywhere and will not let him go.
Was the early Thomas Merton the kind of guy you would have picked up as up for this queering living, or did he, somehow get there so that you would say, now he's doing it in a way that I resonate with? I mean, certainly by the new Seeds of Contemplation, you mentioned the first version of that one, Seeds of Contemplation, but when I think about Seven Story Mountain, I don't know whether I think about the queering of Thomas Merton yet, but I'd rather hear you talk about it. Was there an early Merton that didn't quite qualify yet?
So what I would look at for, like, let's say, the younger queering of Thomas Merton, I would look at his poetry. I think the ways in which he was playing with words, the ways in which he was looking at things differently his whole life, and the ways in which he engaged. I also think about his letters with Robert Lax, and I think about how goofy and strange those letters were, and how beautifully playful and curious and odd. They looked at things differently. They were creatives together. And I'm not talking about Merton's sexuality, and I'm not making any speculations about that. What I'm saying is that he always hosted an oddity about him, a strangeness about him, a uniqueness about him that that'd be a fun project to do, is queering Merton throughout the years and kind of pointing to some of those ways in which he showed up like that.
Yeah, well, do it. I'd read it.
Okay. Deal.
Here's a question that comes from Hugh Turley. It's a fun, playful question as I read it. Do you think Merton could be the patron saint of queer? And why do you think the monks at Gethsemane do not support his canonization?
That's a great question. I think that's a very fun question. And I think that probably a person who identifies as queer on all levels would be more appropriate for that role, perhaps, in terms of them identifying as queer in terms of their sexuality, as well as the ways in which they live their life.
Probably not a white guy who's Catholic, as I heard you.
Maybe not, but
Yeah. And another question or comment from Patricia Connolly. In the old days, before queer was used in sexuality terms, it was used as meaning odd, as in he's a queer one or an odd one or different. Do you have a sense of when it moved from that, which probably many of us who are old enough think, yeah, that's kind of the way it was used, to the way it's being used now in a sense more engaged, creative way?
I don't. And as an Enneagram 5, I will not speak to that if I do not know any facts about it. But I will say that I appreciate you saying that, because I do need to research that, because I am also engaging the word in that way, because I am claiming my weirdness and my oddity and the ways I show up in the world as strange. And I think it's beautiful and wonderful. And I think we all should embrace those parts of ourselves. So I appreciate that, because it's making me recognize the ways in which the word is being reclaimed in a multitude of ways.
And here's a good one from our friend Chris Pramuk. Can you share a bit about your doctoral studies? You've gone from counseling to ordination to filmmaking to diving even deeper into theological studies. Really an amazing journey. Why the doctorate, and what might be next on your horizon?
Yeah, so thank you for that. One of the things I really enjoyed while working on my Master's of Divinity was teaching, and I got to teach in several classes. That was just a really engaging way for me to meet with students and work with professors. And so that's one of the reasons I'm doing that. That being said, I'm also utilizing this work in the realm of queering contemplative life and finding my own voice as a queer contemplative, and continuing to pursue that for the program, for the studies. So one of the things I'm working on is hopefully working on teaching a class during the time of study as well. So hopefully that will happen. But
anything else you'd like to ask Sophronia?
Cassidy, I'd like to hear more about the book that you have coming in.
Yeah. So the book is called Queer in Contemplation: Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. And it's kind of a combination of personal stories, research, the ways in which, a lot of things I'm speaking to today about how contemplative life has awakened my queerness has awakened my contemplative life. And I talk about things like queering silence, queering the deserts of our lives, the desert experiences, the ways in which queerness can be an advocate and a tool in those barren moments to help us see a way out, to help us, tilt our heads in order to understand where we might be able to find water for our parched places. And queering mysticism and talking about the ways I see mysticism as innately queer. Again, mystics fall with trees, the embodied writings, so many mystics. I'm thinking of Miguel H. Diaz's book, Queer God de Amor, which is a book that talks about the queerness of the writings of St. John of the Cross. It's a really excellent book. Highly recommend that. And yeah, I talk about queering the liminal space, and I talk about the closet experience as a liminal space, and the ways in which some folks need to stay in the closet for safe or their own protection, and the ways we can engage that space and out, or behind or ahead of that closet experience. And yeah, just a variety of ways to look at particular aspects of contemplative life, either queer and also invitational into the ways that we can queer these and in them and enliven.
And what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
Yeah, on the dedication page, I was stuck there for a little bit, because I thought about that question, and the book ended up being dedicated to the queerness in each of us. And so my hope is that the book would allow people to engage with the world here and their own experience of personal contemplative life differently. And it's my hope that it gives us kind of permission to awaken different parts of ourselves and recognize the ways in which contemplative life can deepen our roots, can allow us to continually become and step into more of who we are.
Let me ask you one last question, Sophronia, and then Cassidy, Sophronia can listen in, and then we'll throw it back to Teresa.
Only if it's a hard one.
No, I'm going to make it this is the easy one you wanted me to ask you all along.
Oh, good.
I'm really interested in how you and the International Thomas Merton Society could continue to partner in an important work like this. I'm reflecting back. You were a Daggy scholar when you were younger. You've been involved in ITMS. Part of the reason we're doing these Tuesdays with Merton is to try to find new voices that aren't always quite as public. You're a pretty public voice, but you're clearly not an old guy like me. So what do you see ahead for ITMS, the Merton Society, and how could it help you, and what challenge do you offer us as we move forward into this 21st century? How can we queer this century?
There you go. I love it. When I first came to my first ITMS conference was in 2015 at Bellarmine. And our president, Chris Pramick, who I always call out on this every time I see him, gave an incredible talk. And I wish I could remember the title, Chris, but it's something about God accompanying persons. And in that talk, I'm sure Paul will toss it in the chat right away, because Paul's always on that. In that talk, Chris really invited and evoked a conversation, I think, that started then between the society. And that talk was about LGBTQIA people in particular. And it was really, really powerful and really, really meaningful to be in a room of scholars and, just willing to learn and eager, curious. And I think the ITMS as a whole, the society as a whole, models that curiosity in so many beautiful ways, right? You don't have to be a scholar to be a part of the society. In fact, you can present a creative project and we will call you a scholar because you are your intuitive knowledge. You are using your inner embodied wisdom. And I think that what's so beautiful about the society is that in many ways it is pretty queer, and beautifully it is so focused on the importance of relationship and friendship and care and getting to know each other so that we do widen our view of incarnation. And I think that I have a lot of hope for the society, that it's something I could not imagine not part of. It's been an incredible support. And particularly, there is no other conference or group I'm a part of that truly honors the vastness of what scholarship is. And, from our embodied knowledge to poetry, presentations, film, music, dance, art. And I think that that's really, really honoring of what it means to see each other, what it means to friendships, and what it means to queer Thomas Merton.
Great.
And I'm happy to have more conversations like this, Alan.
Cheers.
And I will
next time in Indy.
I will point out that Paul did put the title of the talk in the chat.
I knew he would.
Paul's the best.
Francis,
yeah.
Gender,
Thank you, Paul.
Diversity.
It's all yours, Teresa.
All right. Well, thank you, Cassidy. I was just enthralled by the title, and I had no idea where we were going to go with it. You touched me very deeply, and I could tell from the comments and the questions that you touched a lot of us and expanded our horizons, queered our horizons, I guess I could say. I want to thank Julia Feder. You didn't see her today, but she's been behind the scenes, like the ghost in the machine. She's from the Center for Spirituality, for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's, and she provided the technical support for today's presentation. Alan Culp always does such a beautiful job moderating the questions, and today was accompanied by Sophronia Scott, and they make a great duo when it comes to the questioning. So thank you both so much. Bob Grip is the person who posts the webinars on YouTube. He's so good at that, and he's so good at getting it out very quickly. So you can tell your friends it'll be there probably tomorrow. Mark Mead does the same by making these presentations available as podcasts. You can find links to the recordings of previous webinars at merton.org/ITMS. And now I am so very excited to announce the very first annual Fourth and Walnut Lecture featuring Ilia Delio. She's going to speak on Merton's Christophany and the Second Axial Monk. Ilia is a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., and an award-winning theologian, specializing in the area of science and religion. The event will take place on Tuesday, November 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the campus of St. Mary's College and will also be live streamed. Please note that this event will start an hour earlier than usual. For more information about this wonderful opportunity, go to the website of the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College or the website of the International Thomas Merton Society. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for continuing to spread the good word about Tuesdays with Merton. So now, goodbye, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you next month in person or online.